Hi, I'm Dr. Joseph Wellman. I got my PhD at the University of Maine, and I did a postdoc at Wesleyan University in Connecticut before coming here to the University of Mississippi. My research mainly focuses on prejudice and stigma and kind of the experience of being stigmatized and how that affects individuals. And I look at it from kind of both how do we kind of cope with stigma, how does it kind of influence both our behaviors, our actions, our perceptions, our thoughts about ourselves, as well as kind of what motivates kind of bias or prejudice or stigmatization of others. I think we've all experienced stigma for one thing or another at some point, and it was really kind of trying to understand that experience, both in terms of what motivates people to kind of stigmatize or discriminate or derogate people, but also kind of what are the consequences of that. So, in terms of people's weight, their sexual orientation, their gender, their race, all of those things I've kind of studied over the years because there's a lot of commonalities in the experience across the board. While different motivations for targeting different groups may vary, the experience of being stigmatized seems to be fairly universal, regardless of kind of why you're being stigmatized. And so I was very kind of fascinated with why are people engaging in this behavior. I started off, some of my initial research was looking at kind of violation of gender norms and how that influences kind of bias towards gay men and lesbian women, as well as kind of how masculinity threat amongst heterosexual men specifically may also promote kind of bias towards gay men and specifically feminine gay men. Some of my other research looks at race, particularly white-black dynamics, as well as gender dynamics, so male-female dynamics and so forth. And to the extent that high-status groups, men, white individuals in this context, perceive that they're in a zero-sum game, that as progress for one group occurs, it comes at a cost to my group. That also seems to motivate this prejudice or this bias towards those individuals. How do people respond to shifting dynamics, right? So LGBT individuals, we perceived that they've made a lot of progress in recent years. That if we basically show this to people and say, like, here's what's happening, LGBT, more people and more people are identifying as LGBT, how do people perceive that information, right? And in a series of studies, what we've found essentially is that white individuals, heterosexual individuals, and specifically Christian individuals tend to perceive that to be a threat to themselves. And they tend to perceive that they're in this zero-sum game when they're presented with that information, so that they feel like the progress that LGBT individuals are making is coming at a cost to them. However, LGBT individuals don't perceive it as this zero-sum game. And so to the extent that I perceive it as this zero-sum game, that does tend to be associated with kind of more derogation, anti-LGBT kind of policies, support for those types of policies, and willingness to protest kind of against LGBT rights. There seems to be an inherent threat that people have with progress, that they seem to perceive it to be not just progress, but they seem to perceive it to be bias against their own groups, when in reality, the two things are not connected. We're not in a zero-sum game, and there's very little evidence suggesting that we are, that as prejudice towards LGBT individuals declines, that bias towards straight or heterosexual individuals is increasing. We don't have widespread evidence of any of that, but that perception we do get consistently. And I think also the loss of privilege itself often feels like discrimination, right? So a lot of the policies surrounding affirmative action, a lot of the policies surrounding kind of equality and kind of equity and diversity and so forth, they're not about kind of favoring one group over another. They're about equalizing and kind of making sure everyone's on the even playing field. But what that feels like often to people who have traditionally been favored within those systems, it may actually feel like bias. when in reality it's just a loss of this privilege and this upper hand that you had at one point that you no longer necessarily have. But I think because we feel that way, it becomes hard for people to kind of support these things, right? So how do we frame this in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're being discriminated against or derogated against, or that they're losing something? I think that in terms of what's most important right now, I think a lot of it's thinking about nuance, right? That for a lot of our research, we're never sure kind of which way to go, right? Or does this apply to everybody? And there are probably always going to be other kind of boundary conditions and barriers and things. So a lot of my recent research has taken kind of an intersectional approach to things, where I'm combining some of the different areas of stigmatization that we've talked about over the years into one. So I've been looking at some weight stigma and bias amongst LGBT individuals. How does that affect them? And is it the same kind of experience to kind of be stigmatized for one's weight when you're a member of this population versus when you're heterosexual or straight? And what we end up seeing is that it does seem to have some different consequences. So as we're trying to kind of formulate interventions or kind of think about how do we approach these things, it may be important for us to examine kind of the intersections of these different stereotypes or different expectations that we place upon individuals.